The penthouse was on the 32nd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows on three sides, a view of the city that looked like something you would frame and hang on a wall if you could afford to, marble floors, a private elevator, the kind of apartment that makes you understand, in a physical way, what the word wealth actually means when it has had decades to compound quietly. My grandfather had lived there for 19 years. I had visited dozens of times, always welcomed in, always offered tea in a cup that was too fine for everyday use, always sent home with something. A book, a jar of the marmalade he made himself every January, a folded piece of paper with something he had written down that he thought I should read. 3 weeks after his funeral, I stood in that penthouse again. This time, my parents were already there. They had arrived before me, with boxes, with a moving company, with a key I had not known they possessed. My mother was directing the movers toward the artwork on the walls. My father was on the phone, speaking quietly in the corner, his back to me. Neither of them had called to tell me they were coming. Neither of them had mentioned that they were planning to clear out the penthouse. I stood in the doorway of my grandfather's home, a home I had loved my entire life, and I felt something I had never felt before in relation to my parents. Not sadness, not confusion. Clarity. And what I was about to discover in the next 24 hours would change everything they thought they had already secured. My name is Grace, and in my family, I was the granddaughter, not the daughter, which meant I occupied a specific and comfortable distance from the dynamics that shaped everything else. My parents, my father Leonard and my mother Sylvia, had always had a complicated relationship with money. Not in the way of people who don't have enough, in the way of people who always wanted more than they had, and who measured their worth by the gap between what they possessed and what they felt they deserved. My grandfather, Edmund, was my father's father. He had built a real estate development company from his 20s, sold it in his 60s for a figure that the family discussed in hushed and reverent tones, and then retreated into a life of deliberate simplicity, except for the penthouse, which he had purchased because, as he told me once, I spent 40 years working hard. I wanted to look at something beautiful every morning. He was not a complicated man. He was precise, generous, and completely honest in the way that only people who have nothing left to prove tend to be. I remember being 8 years old and visiting him with my parents. My father spent most of the visit asking my grandfather about his investment decisions. My mother spent it mentally rearranging the furniture. I spent it sitting beside my grandfather on the balcony while he pointed out the buildings he had helped construct, telling me their stories the way other people tell fairy tales. When I was 17, he gave me a small framed print for my birthday. It was a quote, just a few words, and when my mother saw it, she said, he could have given her something valuable. He had. She just couldn't see it. He and I spoke every week for the last 12 years of his life. He asked about my work. I was an architect, which he found fitting and said so often. He asked about my friends, my projects, my thinking. He was the most genuinely curious person I have ever known. When he passed, I grieved him the way you grieve someone who was irreplaceable, completely and without hurry. But I was about to find out how wrong they all were about what he had left behind. My grandfather passed in October. The funeral was quiet, as he had requested immediate family only, no speeches, no flowers beyond what was already in the room. What followed was not quiet. Within a week, my parents had begun making calls. I knew this because people called me, distant relatives, my grandfather's old assistant, a neighbor from the building, all mentioning conversations they had received from my father about the estate, about the penthouse, about what Leonard is planning to do with everything. I called my father. He told me the estate was being handled, that there was a process, that I shouldn't worry. I asked him directly, has Grandpa's will been read? It's being handled, he said again. He said that phrase 4 times in that conversation. Each time, something tightened in my chest that I could not name. 3 weeks after the funeral, I received no communication from any solicitor, no formal notification about the estate, nothing that would suggest I was considered a beneficiary or even an interested party. I called the building management of the Penthouse to ask a simple question about my grandfather's lease arrangements. The property manager, a kind woman named Helen who had known my grandfather for a decade, paused before answering. "Miss Grace," she said carefully, "your parents were here on Tuesday. They've already filed a change of authorized access. Your name was removed from the building's approved visitor list." I sat with that sentence for a very long time. My name had been on that list since I was 19 years old. My grandfather had put it there himself. It had never been discussed, never been mentioned. It had simply been there, the way things are there when someone wants to make sure you are always welcome. And my parents had removed it, without telling me, without asking. 3 weeks after my grandfather's funeral, before any will had been formally read, before any legal process had been concluded, they had walked into his building and begun erasing my access to it. They thought they had already won. They had forgotten one thing. I called my grandfather's solicitor directly the following morning. His name was Mr. Arthur Pemberton. He had handled my grandfather's legal affairs for 22 years. When I introduced myself, he was quiet for just a moment, and then he said something that told me everything. "Miss Grace, I've been expecting your call. I was wondering when you would reach out." "My parents," I said, "they've been—" "I'm aware," he said. "Your father contacted me 11 days ago. He informed me that he would be managing the estate process and that communication should go through him exclusively." I felt something cold move through me. "And did you agree to that?" I asked. Another pause. "No," he said, "because I had specific instructions from your grandfather about exactly this situation. He asked me to come to his office. I went the next morning. Mr. Pemberton's office was lined with files and smelled of old paper and order. He sat across from me and placed a sealed document on the desk, my grandfather's will, formally prepared, witnessed, and dated 14 months before his passing. He opened it. My parents received the contents of the estate's liquid assets, a figure in the region of £1.2 million after taxes. Substantial, more than most people see in a lifetime. The Penthouse, valued in the current market at £8 million, had been left entirely and exclusively to me. Not jointly, not shared, not to be divided. To me. Mr. Pemberton turned the page. There was a letter, my grandfather's handwriting, familiar, precise. "Grace," it began, "if you are reading this with Arthur, then the process has gone exactly as I expected it might. I want you to know that I planned for this carefully. The Penthouse is yours because you are the only person who ever visited it to see me, not to see what I had. I trust you to know what to do with it. You always have." I set the letter down on the desk. Mr. Pemberton looked at me quietly. "Your father," he said carefully, "has already filed an informal objection claiming he was unaware of this arrangement and that your grandfather lacked capacity at the time of signing." "Did he?" I asked. "Your grandfather was examined by 2 independent physicians 14 months ago, both of whom certified his full cognitive capacity at the time the will was signed." He paused. "The objection will not succeed." I picked up the letter again, read the last line one more time, and then I understood exactly what I needed to do next. I gave my parents 48 hours. Not because I needed the time, because I wanted them to have settled into their certainty before I arrived. When I knocked on their door, my parents' house, the house I had grown up in, my mother answered in the kind of casual clothes that suggested she had been home all day, comfortable. My father was in the living room with a glass of wine. They looked like people who believed things had gone according to plan. I sat down across from them, without being invited to. I placed Mr. Pemberton's formal letter on the coffee table between us, the one that outlined the estate settlement in full. My mother looked at it. My father set down his glass. "What is this?" he said. "Grandpa's will," I said. "The formal summary. You should read it." He picked it up. His eyes moved across the page. I watched his face change. Not dramatically, not in the way of films, just a quiet, specific draining, the kind that happens when a plan collapses without warning. "The penthouse," he said. "Is mine," I said, "entirely, as it has been since the will was signed 14 months ago." My mother's expression shifted. "Grace, your grandfather was not well toward the end. He wasn't thinking clearly when—" "He was examined by 2 independent physicians," I said. "Both certified his full capacity. Mr. Pemberton has those documents. Your objection has already been reviewed and will not be upheld." Silence. "You removed my name from the building's access list," I said, "before the will was read, before any legal process had concluded." My father looked at the table. "I want to understand something, not to argue, just to understand. Did you genuinely believe he would leave it to you, or did you know about me and decide to move first anyway?" Neither of them answered. That was its own kind of answer. "I'm not going to fight you," I said. "There is nothing to fight. The will is clear, the physician's records are clear, Mr. Pemberton has everything." I stood up. "But I want you to know I knew exactly who Grandpa was. I knew what he valued, and he knew exactly who I was, too." I picked up the letter. "He left me the penthouse," I said, "because I visited him, not it. Him." I walked to the door. My father said my name once, quietly, with something in it I hadn't heard before. Not quite an apology, but close enough to recognize. I turned around. "He made me marmalade every January. I still have last year's jar." And I walked out. The formal estate process concluded in just under 3 months. My father's objection was dismissed. Mr. Pemberton handled everything with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been doing this for 22 years and had seen every variation of what grief does to families when money is involved. The penthouse transferred to my name on a Tuesday in February. I went alone. I took the private elevator to the 32nd floor. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked at the city, the same view my grandfather had looked at for 19 years, the buildings he had pointed at when I was 8 years old, the skyline he had watched change through every decade of his retirement. I made tea in his kitchen, in one of the fine cups that my mother had always called impractical. I sat on the balcony. I have not sold the penthouse. I do not intend to. I live there now part-time, working from the study that still has his books on the shelves, because I have not been able to bring myself to move them, and I am not sure I ever will. My relationship with my parents is careful and measured. We are not estranged, but something has been said between us, quietly, without drama, that cannot be unsaid. What I have, this view, these windows, his books, last year's jar of marmalade that I cannot bring myself to open, no objection, no filing, no attempted access list removal can reach that. He knew who visited for him, and he made sure I would always have somewhere to come home to. Some people walk into a room and see what it contains. Others walk in and see the person inside it. My grandfather understood this distinction completely, and he made his decisions accordingly, with the clarity of someone who had lived long enough to know exactly what mattered. The things we do when no one appears to be watching, those are the things that compound quietly over time, into trust, into love, into something that cannot be transferred without permission. If you have ever shown up for someone, not for what they had, but for who they were, this story was for you. Drop a heart if you believe that genuine love always leaves a record. Comment below. Has someone surprised you with how much your presence meant to them? Tell me. I read every single one. Subscribe because every week we tell the stories of women who showed up quietly, loved honestly, and discovered that someone had been keeping track all along. Because the people who visit for you are the ones worth leaving everything to.